Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA biology class. We are looking at second semester biology B, which you guys know, of course. We are looking here in I believe we're in unit 3. Yep, unit 3, lesson 6, life processes. So that is the lesson we are on. The key words for this lesson, most of them are going to be repeats and familiar from previous lessons. We are kind of building on concepts that we've been studying up to this point in the semester. But we do have a new one as well. The new term is biomagnification, but we still have gross primary productivity, net primary productivity, photosynthesis, and then primary productivity, the 10% rule, and trophic level. So those are all kind of repeats. Some you've seen once, some you've seen more than once, and we're just kind of enhancing what we know about these. As always, just kind of refer you to the notes guide, our little study guide that goes along with this. It is in a link right underneath the video on my homepage here. So you should be able to get access to that study guide, and that's going to just help you know what key concepts you should be taking notes on. All right. So as we start here with life processes, it talks about how the primary source of energy for most ecosystems is the sun. And that's true for, again, most ecosystems. There are some exceptions. There are some extreme environment ecosystems. We see these like, for example, with hydrothermal events in the depths of the ocean that rely on chemicals within those hydrothermal events as their source of energy. But, those are the exceptions. And since the rule is the sun, we're going to study photosynthetic ecosystems, those that rely on the sun as the basis for all energy. So the sun provides energy to our primary producers. Those are our plants and algae and microorganisms that also do photosynthesis. Those are what we call our autotrophs or photoautotrophs to be specific. They make their own food by taking the energy from the sun plus water plus carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis, right? So they're able to fix that carbon using photosynthesis and be able to make sugars. They release oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. And so that sugars that are made are then available to your consumers for a source of food. So plants then will take the sugars and they'll be able to construct more complex carbohydrates from them as well, like starches. And then a consumer, a first order consumer, a primary consumer can come and eat the plants and get food. And then you've got carnivores or second order consumers that can come and eat the first order consumers and get their food, and so on and so forth up that trophic pyramid, which we talked about in previous lessons, right? So we can look at the productivity of an ecosystem. And primary productivity is the rate that plants and other photosynthetic organisms, so like algae and other microorganisms that do photosynthesis, the rate that they produce organic compounds. That is called the primary productivity. So basically, we're measuring the rate that energy is captured and stored by plants and some algae and then is available to the next trophic level. It says here primary productivity takes into account the amounts of organic compounds used in cellular processes that are not transferred to the next trophic level and any outside factors that might be storing or releasing inorganic compounds. So we have two different measures of primary productivity. We have gross and net. And just like with all systems, you have to take into consideration that sometimes you might earn something, but then it needs to be spent before you can kind of calculate the total amount that you make, right? And the example that we gave in the previous lesson was I have a paycheck that I earn twice a month. That's what I do. And when I get my paycheck, I have my gross pay on the paycheck, and then, I have to pay taxes, and sometimes there's money taken out for insurance and stuff like that. And so I have an amount of money that I'm given in this check that is my net pay. My net pay is always less than my gross pay. It is my pay less those expenses that I have that are fixed expenses that come out prior to actually giving me the paycheck, right? So plants have these fixed expenses as well. They have to use energy to do processes in their own bodies. For example, to do cellular respiration, they need energy, right? So when you subtract the energy requirements of the plant from the total amount of energy that the plants make, then you end up with your net primary productivity. So gross primary productivity is the total amount of energy captured by plants and other photosynthetic organisms. So if you just measure, they're absorbing all this energy from the sun, how much energy are they absorbing? That's what your GPP is. Then if you subtract the energy that those plants and other photosynthetic organisms use to be able to do and live, they need to do cellular respiration so they can get energy for their bodies so that they can grow and they can, reproduce and all sorts of things as well. Then you end up with a total amount that's left over, and that's what the net primary productivity is. And here they give you kind of some examples of how you can calculate that. They say if the gross primary productivity for a patch of forest is 10 kilograms of carbon per square meter per year, so this is the amount of carbon and mass. This is per square meter. That's like the area of forest that we're covering, and in a given period of time. And the amount of carbon that is basically used is 7 to do all their metabolic functions through respiration. What's left over is 3, and that 3 is what we call the net primary productivity. So it's just a really simple arithmetic problem. So how do we measure primary productivity? We use one indicator is a measure of oxygen. If you think about photosynthesis and respiration, which is really what we're talking about here, a common denominator is oxygen. Oxygen is produced in photosynthesis and it is used in respiration, right? And so if it is produced in photosynthesis and then that oxygen is taken up again and used in respiration, we can look at oxygen as kind of being a common factor. So basically, what scientists will do in a laboratory setting is they can actually measure how much um, oxygen is released during photosynthesis. So it says these are a good measure. Gross primary productivity can be measured by how much oxygen is given off by a plant during photosynthesis. Okay, so during photosynthesis, how much oxygen are we kind of generating, or these plants generating? That's a measure of gross primary productivity. Then they shut the lights off, and then they measure how much oxygen is being used. And the reason why they shut the lights off is because respiration can take place in the dark. It doesn't need to take place in the light. We kind of want to stop photosynthesis because it's only during that first part, the light reactions, that oxygen is released. So we don't want to like mess up and kind of muddy our data. We don't want oxygen to be simultaneously being produced and used, because if we have the lights on, plants will be doing photosynthesis and respiration at the same time. So to measure respiration only, shut the lights off, and then plants can't do the light part of photosynthesis. They can't do the light reaction, so they're not going to be releasing any more oxygen. But they can do respiration. So they will be taking oxygen in. So then they can measure the amount of oxygen that's taken in with the lights off. And the difference between the two can tell them essentially how much the net primary productivity is, right? Because they're releasing all this oxygen. That tells us pretty much how much photosynthesis is happening. How much is being taken back in tells us, what's kind of left to be used at that point. This is kind of a cool measure, I think, because you're using something that's a common denominator in both photosynthesis and respiration. And so um, this little illustration here is kind of showing you that as well. So oxygen is being released during the light reactions of photosynthesis, is being taken in during respiration. There we go. All right. So then we just remember like that not obviously there's some inefficiency in energy transfer, right? So as we're looking at this productivity, the difference between gross and net, we know we're losing some energy between photosynthesis and respiration. It's not really lost, however, the energy is being used, right, by the plant to do its own little metabolic functions. So when we look at how energy is transferred through an ecosystem, we're not just looking at a single organism, but you're looking at how much energy plants produce now. They're producing. This is basically their net primary productivity. And then how much is available to the next higher trophic level. So how much is available to those primary consumers? We remember the 10% rule. The 10% rule tells us that only 10% of the energy that is being produced by the plants is then available to the first order consumers to be able to use for their bodies. 90% of it is not available. And so that's kind of an inefficiency in the system. But not all systems have or use available exactly 10%. Some are actually more efficient, and you'll see more than 10% transferred from one trophic level to the next. Some actually have less efficiency. They have less than 10% transferred from one trophic level to the next. And so the lesson talks about the reasons why this changes. Like, why is it either more or less inefficient? And it says that not all organisms at lower trophic levels will be consumed when they die. Dead organisms and waste are broken down by decomposers and recycled through the ecosystems. So you're not able to transfer all of the energy because not everything is going to get eaten. Just because a plant is available to be used for energy doesn't mean it's actually consumed, right? A lot of those plants will just wither and die and decompose, never having been eaten by a primary consumer. And the same thing is true if you go up a level. Your primary consumers, right? You've got rabbits or whatever. And maybe the rabbits are eaten by the foxes, but not every single rabbit that's ever born will be eaten by a fox. Many of those rabbits just go on to live their rabbity type lives, eventually die, decompose, and they go back into, the soil essentially to be available to um, as nutrients for plants to grow again. So their mass is recycled into the ecosystem. So that's one thing. And some organisms are not always fully consumed. Just because you eat something doesn't mean you use all the energy that's available in that particular thing that you eat. Some of the energy your body uses and some of it passes through your digestive system as waste. You can't digest it for one reason or another, and then you poop it out. It goes back into the ecosystem. It is decomposed again and recycled. So it's kind of the same thing. You're not always able to use all of the nutrients that you eat for many different reasons. For example, human beings, we don't have the ability to digest cellulose in plants. Because of that, that's the fiber that we eat in our diet. And so we can't actually digest that. So it always just kind of passes right through our digestive systems. So just because we eat it doesn't mean we have the capacity to digest it. All right, so that's the end of this first part of the lesson. Then it moves on after your questions and your videos to this section called life processes. And the last thing it talks about is something called biomagnification. Biomagnification is really the process of how something within an ecosystem becomes stronger and more concentrated as it moves up to higher levels in the trophic pyramid. And generally, we're talking about toxins or pollutants and things like that. So essentially, when an organism is at the lower levels of the trophic pyramid, if a toxin is introduced, that toxin can be passed on to an organism in the next higher trophic level. And then as that organism consumes the toxin and gets it into their bodies, they can pass it on to organisms that are above them in the trophic pyramid as well. So since toxins are introduced at the lower levels, they're consumed like many different organisms that have the toxins are then consumed by a single organism in the next higher trophic level, right? So then they have the capacity to get more of that toxin, because if this thing has toxin and that thing has toxin and that thing has toxin, etc., you're going to get more toxins concentrated into this guy than you did in these just because he's bigger and he eats more of the little guys. then we can assume this little crayfish, the fish, is going to eat multiple crayfish. So each crayfish has a higher concentration of toxin, and the fish having eaten multiple of them will then in turn have a higher concentration of toxin in him as well. Now he's more concentrated with toxin, and even if this large fish only eats like 3 or 4 of the small fish, each fish is more concentrated in toxin, and he's going to be even more concentrated, right? And you kind of see how this is going. So this is what's called biomagnification. An example of biomagnification occurred in the early 1970s. A pesticide at that time, which was pretty commonly used, and it was a very, very general pesticide, so it was used for um, insect control for a lot of different insects. And it was banned in 1972. What they found is that this pesticide, DDT, caused a problem with bald eagles. Bald eagles consumed many different things, fish and some small, rodents and things like that. But even though the pesticide was used on insects, um, through the process of biomagnification, it became more and more concentrated in the higher trophic levels until the bald eagles, being way the heck up here in the trophic pyramid, had a very, very high concentration of this pesticide in their bodies. The result is that the pesticide actually caused them to lay eggs with very, very thin eggshells. And so they would lay their eggs, but the eggs would break before the babies could actually incubate and hatch. And so we had a really small number of chicks that were born to bald eagles. And it was finally figured out, why are bald eagles dying out? Why are we reducing the number of bald eagles? It was traced back to this pesticide DDT, which was then outlawed in 1972. They were put on the endangered species list as well. But as a result of getting rid of DDT, the bald eagles actually recovered, and they were removed finally from the endangered species list just a few years ago in 2007. So just an example of how stuff flows through an ecosystem, and how the process of biomagnification in this case can lead to an excess levels of this toxic chemical in those higher trophic levels. And just, to be clear about this, we are kind of at a higher trophic level. And so obviously it's a concern not just for other organisms like eagles and, you know, pandas or sharks or whatever that are at those high trophic levels, but for human beings as well, because we are, as well at a higher trophic level. And so that means that through the process of biomagnification, we could end up with higher levels of toxins in our bodies that, you know, it's not like we directly consume those toxins, but they could end up in our bodies as well. So it's something to watch out for. All right, so that is everything here, guys, from this lesson. Lesson 6, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.